Hi Adam, here's the feedback for the written part of the mock exam that you did recently. You scored 4 marks for the first question, so that's a good start with the full 4 marks there. So if we move on to question 2, where you've been asked to analyse how the writer used the language to describe the effects of the storm. Okay, so you started off by saying, in this source, the writer uses a range of sentence forms, simple, compound and complex. For example, and then you've given the example of a complex sentence, which lists what had awaited him, the noise, and so on. And your analysis is this is a good complex sentence because the writer used a list. Yeah, good point. Wind, lashing and thunder. This gets the point across. Very basic but very easy. I think to score higher marks you needed to have said exactly what the point was. You could have said that lashing gives the impression that the wind is really whipping the trees about and trying to batter the land with the trees. You've then gone on to say that he uses personification, the roaring Pacific Ocean. That's again, it's a good example of terminology. But your analysis here is a bit weak, where you've just said it makes it sound better than saying the loud Pacific Ocean. I think if you'd have zoomed in a little bit more on roaring and said, you know, it's making a deafening noise, or it's quite animalistic, it could suggest that it's attacking the land like a wild animal. And then you've again used personification of the furious waves against the rock. And then you said there the writer, the way the writer writes this, it's like the waves are angry with the rocks, which is a good point. I mean, you could have said it shows how aggressive the storm is. So if we look at the mark scheme for this question, so for level 2, attempts to comment on the effects of the language. Yeah, I think you have. I think it does need to be more depth to get you up into level 3, but I think we can say you have attempted. You have selected some appropriate textual detail, and you have made some use of subject terminology, and the terminology that you've used is appropriate. So I think it is level 2, and the fact that some of your analysis is a little bit on the weak side, it's going to be 3 out of the possible 8 marks for that question. But if you can try and look a little bit more in depth into your analysis, then that will help you to get up to that level 3 band. You're moving on to question 3, where you've been asked to comment on how the text is structured to interest you as a reader. Now, unfortunately, the first part of this isn't relevant because you're talking about the sentence structures, and that comes into question 2. I mean, you've already commented on the complex sentence in your previous question, so all of this really is not relevant to this question. It's the structure of it, in that what it's focusing in on, and you know how it starts, the middle, the end, and so on. So it's only from this bit here, finally, in my opinion, the writer changes the focus as the source develops to show the different sides to Alex. And you've gone on to say, for example, at the start it was a bad time because he had a nightmare, and you've given the quote. He didn't want to get out of bed because he thought it was going to be a bad day, and again you've given the quote. And then you've said towards the end of the source he remembered everything about his mum and what she did for him, and you've given a quote to back that up. So had you done more along those lines, then you would have scored higher marks. You could have talked about the fact that the first part of the text was just about Alex, and we're learning about his nightmare and his worries, and then the second half shows how he interacts with his family, and the way that he snaps at his sisters and so on. And where you've mentioned the quote, he decided that this was going to be a terrible day. You could have gone on and given the quote where it says there's been a lot of these since his mother got sick, because that's important, because that's the first time we've learned that his mum is ill, and it puts the rest of it into perspective when we know about the nightmare, and it makes sense to us then that the bird carrying off his mother could indicate that she's going to die, or at least that Alex is worried that she's going to die. You could have mentioned the first sentence where we learn the time, the place, and the characters. We learn that it's Alex, we learn that it's at dawn and that he's in bed. So it starts us off giving us all that information. So anyway, if we look at the mark scheme for this question, I think we can only say it offers simple comment on the effective structure, because you've not really given us too much of how the structure affects you as the reader in the bit that's relevant. You have selected some appropriate examples up here, and you have made use of some of the subject terminology, and it is appropriate. This is where you said finally the writer changes focus as the source develops. For example, at the start, and then down here you say then towards the end of the source. So that's all the relevant terminology. So I think for these two you've met the criteria at level 2. This one is only level 1, so I think it's going to be 3 out of the possible 8 marks for this question. Okay, so moving on to question 4, where you're asked to what extent do you agree with the statement that this part of the story shows that Alex is struggling to cope with his mother's illness. You started off saying that you completely agree with the statement, because he seems to be down about everything. You said you think it's because he doesn't have the energy to do anything, and he's being optimistic about what's going to happen. Are you sure you mean optimistic there? And you've given the quote that he decided this was going to be a terrible day. You've then gone on to say, secondly, he misses his mother, what his mother used to be like before she became ill. You give him the quote, he missed her easy laughter and affection, and the fact that she still welcomed her children after school with cookies. And you've compared that to what she's like now. He barely got out of bed and was little more than a silent ghost. Now this question's worth 20 marks, so you would have needed to have written more for this question. I don't know whether you just didn't have enough time left before you needed to go on and do your question 5 answer. But if we look at the mark scheme, make simple, limited, evaluative comments on the effect on the reader. Yeah, so you've not really written enough for me to say that it's attempted. Shows limited understanding of the writer's methods, and again, you've not really commented on how the writer does it. So you could have mentioned that the writer shows that Alex isn't coping in the dialogue that he uses, where he gets angry at his sisters and then he's angry at everybody. Now you have commented here on the comparison of his mum before she got ill to now. If you'd have said the writer uses the comparison to show how Alex isn't coping, and then given the quotes that you've done there, that would have been showing how the writer is showing you that Alex isn't coping. You have selected some appropriate texts, and you have only made a simple, limited response to the focus of the statement because you've only mentioned it here. Oh, maybe not, because you have mentioned it again there, haven't you? So possibly some of it makes some response to the focus of the statement and select some appropriate references. So I think these two are possibly level 2. These two are level 1. So if we go for 6 out of the possible 20 marks for this question, because you would need to write a lot more points than that in your exam to get higher marks.